I'm Richard Black. I'm a former BBC Science and Environment correspondent. I also used to run a think tank in London on climate change, so I've been following climate change science for, about 25 years now. And today on Movement Edu, I'm going to be talking a little bit about wine and how climate change might affect the production of wine across the world, and think about what that means for Georgia. So climate change is already having an effect on wine production, and the forecasts are that it's going to have a much greater impact as the years go by and the world warms up. So the two main things that scientists have found is that the increasing temperature and the reduced water availability have an impact on the growth and the timing of when fruits are ripe, and some of the content of the grapes as well. So most of the studies have actually come from France and Portugal, these regions of the world that have been, producing wine for centuries, although not quite as long as Georgia, but nevertheless there's quite a welter of scientific evidence from there. So basically, in one study from France, they found that the time when they harvest the grapes is about 3 weeks earlier now than it was in the middle of the last century. You find that the grapes contain more sugar, but they actually are less acidic as well. So there are big differences there for the winemaker to take account of. You tend to get smaller fruit when there's less water availability. So there's all of this as well. But there are some other things that you might not potentially think about. So a few years ago in California, there was a big forest fire. Well, a series of forest fires, really. And there was so much smoke from this that this actually affected grapes while they were hanging on the vines, growing and ripening. And this was a big problem for winemakers in that area because, a smoky grape makes a smoky wine, and they didn't want that. So wildfires are something that are forecast to increase in many regions of the world as the climate changes. So that's something. Winemakers, like farmers, have to be quite adaptable. No 2 years are exactly the same. They're always finding differences in growing conditions. And of course, other trends change as well, like what people want to eat and drink. So I think to a certain extent, this is about winemakers adapting to changed conditions. Will they need, for example, to use different types of grape in the area where they grow wine? Will they have to put irrigation in place so that they can continue to provide water to the vines? But in some regions of the world, probably winemaking is going to become impossible. And there's one study that suggests between 1/4 and 3/4 of the world's wine growing regions, wine growing is going to become much more difficult and perhaps impossible in those regions. Now, for people who live further north, or further south, for example, the South Island of New Zealand or Tasmania in Australia, it could open up new opportunities. Currently it's too cold for wine growing, maybe that will become okay. But for some of the warmer areas, such as Spain, Portugal, France, parts of Australia, parts of North America, where wine is grown currently, there may be no alternative in the long run for some growers, but to actually pack up and find something different to do. One thing I would say is that I haven't really seen any detailed studies on Georgia. And in a way, this is kind of odd because Georgia has such a long tradition of winemaking. But I think for the winemaker in Georgia, there are questions to ask. If we don't have answers, then obviously it would be useful for scientists or maybe government agencies or whatever to actually do some thinking about this, to actually run some computer models of climate change and at least have some idea about what the future conditions might be, and therefore what this might mean for winemaking in Georgia.